So, we're pretty far advanced with learning how to light by now. Should have a pretty good grasp of the basic principles, as well as understanding practical things like what different types of light do and what they're capable of. And we also now know how to reverse engineer the lighting in other people's images. What I want to do this week is try and bring as much of that as possible together and take you through lighting a portrait step by step. So the idea behind this is to illustrate those four basic facets of light, remember, direction, quality, quantity and colour, but anchor it in practical terms. So as we go through this whole exercise, I'm going to talk about nitty-gritty practical details like how you trigger flash and things. I'm going to start with a very basic, straight out of camera, automatic exposure shot and steadily build things up until we've got 4 flashes lighting our subject. At each stage, I'm going to show you setup diagrams where appropriate, like this one. And obviously, as we alter the image, you'll see a new image each time, and hopefully it should be nice and clear what we've been doing. So to put this in context, this was an exercise that I carried out in front of a room full of students at Ravensbourne College, using their lecturer as the subject. Thanks, Matt, very much appreciated. The room itself has windows down one side, but they're fairly small, and like lots of lecture rooms and institutional rooms, it has fluorescent tubes overhead. So that's the ambient light we're talking about. The equipment I used was a Nikon D850 and a 24-70mm lens, which was on a tripod. I then added an SB5000 flash gun, an SB900 flash gun, an SB800 flash gun, and eventually an Elinchrom mains powered head. I used lighting stands and little attachment things like this. I used a pair of cheap and cheerful Calumet radio triggers, coloured gels, Velcro straps, little black plastic baffles and a white shoot-through brolly. Here is the image we are working towards. Now, just in spirit and feel rather than an exact copy for obvious reasons. This is a portrait of pro cyclist Alex Dowsett that I took for Men's Fitness magazine at the London Velodrome. And here is our first shot, taken with the camera on a tripod, on aperture priority exposure mode, automatic white balance, with just the ambient light in the room. So as I said, at each stage I'm going to show you what the image looks like, give you the exposure details, and where appropriate, show you a setup diagram. Now, note the blur around Matt's eyes. This is caused by him moving very slightly during the half-second shutter speed. The camera was on a tripod, so we know it wasn't the camera that moved. This is one of the reasons photographers like shooting with flash. It allows you to get a really decent shutter speed that reduces the risk of your subject moving or getting any camera shake, but still use a low ISO, and they also come in sort of small and convenient packages, but pack quite a punch. With this shot, the camera has simply tried to get a correctly exposed image and a correctly coloured image, because it's on auto white balance as well, under the ambient lighting conditions. The first thing we're going to do to alter this shot is add a flash gun. I'm going to put it straight on the hot shoe of the camera, like this. So in this first shot, the flash is set to TTL auto exposure mode. And since the camera itself is still on auto mode, the camera has chosen the best exposure for the flash based on the light bouncing back from the subject. This means the exposure for Matt is okay, but the wall 8 feet or so behind him is very dark, because of course of inverse square law. Also, the angle of the flash directly on top of the camera means the light isn't very flattering, and it's a long way from the look we're trying to create. The next thing I'm going to do is switch to manual exposure mode on the camera and let some of the ambient light in by opening up the shutter speed, because of course the minute the flash went on, it overpowered the shutter speed, pushed it up to 1/60th, and we lost all that ambient in the room. The setup of the shot hasn't changed, but slowing down the shutter speed has allowed more of the ambient light into the shot, lightening the background, whilst Matt is still primarily lit with the flash. Now the next thing to do is switch the flash to manual power mode. Now I can be in much more control of how much light it puts out from frame to frame. Even more importantly, let's take the flash off camera to mimic the light in the picture we're trying to imitate. Now of course, the minute this comes off the camera away from the hot shoe, we've got to have some way of triggering it. You remember we covered this a few weeks ago in quite a lot of depth, and we've got a few choices. Obviously, cheapest and simplest is just a basic straightforward cable like that. Now, of course, it's a cable, so that means that we can only have the flash a certain distance from the camera, but it does mean we can trigger it. A basic cheap one like that won't do any more than just trigger it though. You can move beyond that to a dedicated cable like this. So that would go into the hot shoe, and then that would have the flash sitting on it. This would allow me some control from the camera, which is great. The drawback is, of course, it's still cabled. I can only move the flash a certain distance before the cable runs out. Then, of course, we come on to the generally more expensive and more complicated thing, which is radio triggers. Now, I've got here two cheap and cheerful Calumet ones, which I've had for donkey's years, and they're what I actually use on this exercise. They're great little things, but because they're cheap and cheerful, all they actually do is just trigger. They work over a very long distance, they're very effective like that, but all they'll do is just tell the flash to fire. And for the sake of what we're doing today, that's actually sufficient. But you can, of course, get dedicated radio systems that will allow you control over a distance as well, but they tend to be more expensive. And of course, because they're dedicated, they'll only work with a set camera and a set type of flash units. Now, whichever of these we use, if we're taking the flash off camera, we need some way of mounting it. These little umbrella mounts are very inexpensive. They're simply a female part in the bottom whereby you stick a lighting stand, a little hole for an umbrella through there, and then a hot shoe where the flash will sit. All we do is we take our radio receiver like that, we sit it in the hot shoe mount like that, and then we slide our flash onto the top of the radio receiver, lighting stand goes in the bottom, umbrella goes in there, and we can now mount this flash wherever we like. So we'll take this and we'll put it around to camera left, okay? So you can see from this setup shot, we've simply taken the flash off camera and moved it round to camera left. And we're triggering it with, as I say, a simple radio trigger. The biggest change here is the shadow across Matt's face. The light is now clearly coming from one side rather than straight on. The quality of the light is quite harsh though. We can look at the shadows being cast across his neck, and we know from looking at the image we're working towards that that was lit with a softer light. So let's add a white shoot-through brolly to the flash, and let's crop in a little bit closer to more mimic the shot that we're after. So here we can see how the light on Matt's face has been softened by that white shoot-through brolly. The shadows on his face are a bit more subtle and their edges have softened. Now what we've also done here is switch from auto white balance to flash, as we're about to start lighting just with flash. And if I start adding things like coloured gels, auto white balance will give us some very varied results from shot to shot. Now we want to start adding some more depth to the shot by bringing in other lights. If we look at the original image, we can see that there is some light on the background, which is what we've kind of kept with this ambient exposure, but there's also a light casting a shadow onto Alex's left shoulder, so we're going to try and recreate that. Now, I'd like to use flash for everything, simply because it would allow me to use a nice fast shutter speed and not worry about shooting at this very, very low shutter speed, which means there's a risk of Matt moving and me getting things blurred. So I'm going to push the flash sync speed as far as it will go, which in this case is 1/250th of a second, and bring in my second flash. Now straight away, at 1/250th of a second shutter speed, very little ambient light shows up. And we're only really using the flash to light with. It's still in its brolly off to the left, although we've moved it slightly, just very slightly around to the side of Matt to throw half his face into shade. Now if we go back and look at the original image, we are getting quite a bit closer, but we do need to add more light. So let's bring in that second light I mentioned at the back of the shot and throw a highlight onto Matt's left shoulder and the left side of his face. So what we've done here is place a second flash gun back and right from the camera's point of view and aimed it back towards Matt. The flash gun in question is a Nikon SB900 set to what's called SU4 mode. That's a fancy way of saying it's using an optical slave. Now pretty much all studio flashes and some flash guns like these have optical slaves, as it's very old and very effective technology. All it does is sense a pulse of light and then set its own flash off. So in a very simple setup, even with lots of lights, all you need to do is trigger one light and the others can be set to optical slaves, and as soon as they see that first light, they'll all go off. It's instantaneous, so you don't have to worry about the speed of light or anything funny. If they're all set to optical slaves, they'll go off. It's very simple technology, it's very robust. You find it, as I say, in all sorts of different flashes, which means you can often mix and match different kit, which is a very, very useful thing to be able to do, I find. This second flash that we've placed down the back also has a little Velcro strap around it, like this, which allows me to attach things to it. And it has, on one side of it, a little bit of corrugated black plastic with Velcro on the other side, stuck on like that. And what that's doing is stopping the flash from aiming into the camera, because this is aiming at Matt, and therefore none of the flashlight should be going into the camera. Now this can be really important when you have lights that are aiming towards the camera, because if we move the backlight too close to the line of the camera, as we can see in this shot, we get what's called flare. Now, don't get me wrong, flare used very carefully can look fantastic, although it is overused quite a lot these days, I feel. What you can see from this shot, of course, is that having that flare in shot completely kills the shadow we've managed to build on the left-hand side of Matt's face. It just flattens it out completely. We want to keep the backlight that was being created the first time round, but without losing all that shadow detail. So we do need to be very careful about where we place our second light. Let's put that second light back where it should be and bring in a third light to add some light to the back wall, because in our original shot we're aiming for, there's a little bit of light and colour and texture to that background behind the cyclist. So we've now added a third light, which is casting its light onto the back wall behind Matt. This light was a Nikon SB800, like this one, probably also held together with tape, and mounted on a little plastic foot like this, just balanced on a desk and chucking its light at the back wall. Again, it's on SU4 mode, so it's working as a simple optical slave. It's on manual power, so I can control how much it's putting out. And the light it's cast has actually thrown a shadow from one of the desks nearby onto the back wall, which, if I was being really fussy, I could adjust, but I quite like the shape and variety it gives me back there, rather than just being a plain white wall. Now, one of the things we're seeing at work here, think back far enough to some of those early videos when we talked about inverse square law, because as you remember, you can't escape it. One of the great things about inverse square law is that it allows you, even in relatively small spaces like this, to light on different planes. So this isn't a terribly large room, but because the light with the brolly on, which we could arguably say is our key light, because that is relatively close to Matt, probably about 2 to 3 feet from him, and then Matt is perhaps 8 feet from the back wall, that means that very, very little of that light from that brolly is hitting the back wall, and we can, if we choose to, light it as a totally separate thing, which is exactly what we're doing. The light that we're throwing from this third flash we've added is throwing lots of light onto the back wall, but not affecting Matt in any way, and the light from the brolly is lighting Matt, and we've controlled that how we like, and that's having very little effect on the background, so we can control these things separately. That's a very, very useful thing to be able to do. What we'll also do to this backlight is we will put some gel on it to give it some colour. So it's not just a plain white wall. And I'm going to use something called CTO, which is colour temperature orange, and that is this one. And I will simply get a piece of Velcro around that flash and Velcro that on to cast an orange light across the back wall. Now, yet again, we can see inverse square law in action, because if we look, this orange light we've added goes from being quite bright and almost yellow through to deeper and darker orange as it progresses from the right hand side of the frame through to the left. And that's because, of course, the light is falling off. You know, this flash gun is placed down on the right hand side, so it's aiming at that back wall, and obviously the right hand side of the wall is nearer to it than the left hand side, and you get natural fall off. Now, in this shot we're trying to create, that's actually quite a useful thing. That's the effect we're after. If instead I wanted to create a much more even light across the background, well, I could either add another light, or I could take this light further back, or I could diffuse it more, I could add a reflector on the opposite side, all of which would balance out the fall of light across that back wall. But as I've come back to so many times, you can't escape inverse square law, whether you like it or not, so as much as possible use it to your advantage. So for the final piece of the puzzle, I'm going to put another colour across the back wall, and I'm going to add a fourth flash to do that. What I'm actually going to use is one that lives in the studio at Ravensbourne where we shot this, which is a big Elinchrom 500 watt second mains powered flash head. And I'm going to put a purple effects gel over the front of it. Now, despite this being a much more powerful unit, I can adjust the powers of it and the flash guns until they're in the same sort of range. And because it's working on an optical slave, they all talk to each other because we're talking about very simple, robust tech. Obviously, with things like TTL remote control and more advanced radio triggers, you can do some quite clever bits and pieces. But when you use old school tech like this, you can actually use quite a wide range of kit. And it might be that, of course, you don't have all the latest all singing, all dancing stuff, but you can get away with some cheaper, older gear, and they can still all play along together. So, we're at our final shot. Let's have a recap of before and after. And let's walk through the stages. We started with a fully automatic shot, no flash, aperture priority exposure mode and auto white balance. We then added a flash on TTL mode to the hot shoe of the camera. We changed the camera to manual exposure mode to allow more ambient light into the shot because we slowed the shutter speed down. We then moved the flash off camera, triggering it with a simple radio trigger. Then we added a white shoot-through umbrella to the flash and changed the white balance to flash to keep the colour consistent from shot to shot. We then changed the shutter speed to the maximum sync speed of 1/250th of a second to exclude the ambient light and reduce the risk of subject movement. Then added a second flash to create a backlight across the subject's left shoulder and left side of face, triggered by an optical slave on manual power. We then made sure to place it carefully so as not to get flare in the shot. We added a third flash, again on manual mode with an optical slave to cast light onto the background. Then added a CTO orange gel to this third flash. And finally added a fourth flash, in this case a larger mains powered unit, again on manual exposure mode, triggered by an optical slave and with a purple effects gel on to throw its light across the opposite side of the background. Okay, so what I've done there is work through the 4 facets of light, which by now we know very, very well indeed, using a mix of quite affordable old-fashioned kit and some bigger, more expensive studio kit. Now obviously we haven't completely copied the original image that we're using for inspiration because it's a point of inspiration, and also it was shot with a professional cyclist inside the London Velodrome rather than a lecturer inside a lecture room. It's more about getting the spirit of the shot across and trying to make an impressive portrait. I should also point out that, of course, going through this whole process step by step in as much detail takes quite a while. However, when you get practice at this, when you get your head round both the principles of light and the actual practical side of things, you'll be pleasantly surprised how quickly you can create images like this. You'll have it down to a matter of minutes before too long. I certainly create images lit like this in a very, very short space of time in my professional life all the time. Okay folks, hope that was detailed enough and informative. If I've missed anything, please stick a question in the comments below and I'll do my very best to answer you. Obviously subscribe so you get notifications, hit like if you like what I'm doing. Coming up in the next 3 weeks, I have got 3 real world lighting scenarios that again I take you through step by step to try and illustrate every part of the process. So I look forward to seeing you then. Bye for now.